I'm pleased to join you today in celebrating our comic book collection, which is one of the largest in the world in a public institution, and in particular, one part of that collection, the SPX collection. In August of 2011, the library and the Small Press Expo, or SPX, joined together to facilitate and develop the library's SPX collection of sequential art, mini comics, graphic novels, and more. In person for the first time since 2019, the Small Press Expo is an annual festival in Bethesda, Maryland, that gives artists, writers, and publishers of comic art in all its various forms the opportunity to meet and exhibit their creations. Under our partnership with SPX, the library acquires independent comics and cartoon art from creators and publishers appearing at the expo, as well as the submissions from the SPX Ignatz Award announced during the festival. Through today's talk, we recognize the rewards of this agreement. Over 5,000 items have come to the library from SPX to date, and celebrate the comic book art form. We're also fortunate today to have with us acclaimed cartoonist, animator, writer, and educator Aimée de Jongh as this year's speaker to share her work and creative process, particularly for her award-winning graphic novel, Days of Sand, Jours de Sable, about the American Dust Bowl of the 1930s, inspired and researched using the Library of Congress collections. The Eisner-nominated book is a bestseller in both her native Netherlands and France. Her first graphic novel, Return of the Honey Buzzard, won the Prix Saint-Michel for Best Dutch Graphic Novel and was made into a film in 2017. Her graphic novels have received various international awards, including in France, Germany, the United States, and Japan. Her latest work with scenarist Ingrid Chabert is the comic book Sois en printemps en hiver, released by Dupuis. Today, Ms. de Jongh has offered to share her insights into her research and creation process for Days of Sand, including her inspiration from the library's Farm Services Administration photograph collection held by the Prints and Photographs Division. And now I'd like to introduce our partner in the program, Mr. Warren Bernard, Executive Director of the Small Press Expo, who would like to say a few words. Warren?
Well, as is my wont, I'm remarkably unprepared for anything formal, so I just want to say what an honor it is to be a partner with the Library of Congress and to really show my appreciation for them for their resources and the efforts and the enthusiasm that they've got for accumulating the culture of the indie comics world at SPX. We've got, as Deb said, 5,000 items. We've got another almost 5,000 items up in prints and photographs, original art, posters, prints, just all kinds of ephemera. And of course, the most interesting of the bunch, at least to me, are the mini comics. And one of the focuses that we do have is that there's a lot of stuff that comes up at SPX that is not submitted for copyright. So it does not come here to the Library of Congress. And the focus we have on this collection is to gather that material up so that one, it's somewhere, and two, because it's not submitted for copyright, that some institution has all of that really cool stuff. This is a double honor for me, triple honor actually, because I'm also honored to, this is the first one of these since 2019. I think this is the 8th one that we've done. Yes. Yeah, going back to 2012, so every year since then, we've been honored to have the SPX lecture at the Library of Congress on the Friday before SPX. And then of course, I'm super honored that it's Aimée who's doing this. I remember when she was starting just the thinking process. You know, Warren, I'm thinking about doing this thing about the Dust Bowl. What do you think? And, of course, we talked, and I kind of followed her on that journey. Warren, yeah, I'm going to come in. I'm going to go out to Oklahoma, and I'm going to go here, and I'm going to go there. And it was just a blast listening to her. So this is especially heartwarming for me because now I get to introduce my good friend Aimée.
Hi, everyone. Wow, Warren, thanks for that. That's beautiful. So hi, everyone. I'm Aimée de Jongh from the Netherlands, and welcome. Thank you all for coming here today. I really appreciate that. And I also need to say thanks, of course, to the Library of Congress for having me today, because it's such a special place here. As Deb mentioned, a part of the book was researched here in the library, so it's kind of a full circle thing to be here and talk about the book. Same thing with SPX, Warren, because yeah, we talked about the book in a very early stage, And so, yeah, it really feels like a full circle. And I also want to thank the Dutch Foundation of Literature, who funded my trip here, but also it gave me a travel fund to do research for this book. So I'm just going to see if this works. I think so. I'm going to talk today about the research for this book, and it's a graphic novel. Usually my work is fiction, and I always use research in some way. I always use photographs, for example, to document stuff. Like, I did a comic about taxis, and I was just looking up photographs about taxis to see how I should draw them. So there's always a kind of research process involved. But with this book, it was very different because it is set in the 1930s in the Dust Bowl, and obviously I wasn't there to witness it. So I had to do some digging, literally, to find the right atmosphere, but also to be historically accurate. That was very important to me because, as you know, the Dust Bowl happened in the 1930s, throughout the 40s even, and there's still people alive today who witnessed the Dust Bowl. So I kind of owe it to them to be accurate about it. So I'm going to, well, basically walk you through the process, how it came about, and the book as it is now, how that was created. First of all, let me just start with, so what we're going to talk about. I'm just going to introduce myself very quickly as an author so you all know what I do and what I make. Then I'm going to talk about Days of Sand, the graphic novel and the research I've done. And I also want to finish this lecture with some Easter eggs. So if you have read the book or if you're going to read the book, these are the like little things that I hid inside the book that you all will see now, but the rest of the world won't. So stick around till the end for the Easter eggs, okay? Okay, so about me, right now I'm 33 years old. Oh my God, I'm old. And I've been working as a comic book artist for about 15 years right now, professionally. I kind of started pretty early on doing newspaper comics for Dutch newspapers, and I studied animation. I have a love for animated films, and in Holland you have some very good schools for animated films, so I studied there. So basically the first jobs I had were a mix of comics for newspapers, animated films, and also anything in between. So for example, I would do storyboards for films and series, or I would do short films where I was the director, and eventually I would do mini comics, small press comics, just kind of to try and experiment. And I remember I was like 15 or 16 years old when I made my first mini comic, and that's when the love for comics really started. And actually, one of the people is here, Kenny, who is one of my friends from Holland, who was with me throughout this process, and we did some comics together way back when. And so it feels like, to me, it feels like I'm a dinosaur in the comic book world. Like I've been doing this for such a long time. But you know, I'm right now, I feel like I'm also only starting exploring the graphic novel scene. So to show you some of the drawings I made in the past, these are some stills from animation projects that I did. The first one, the blue one, is still from a movie that I made for the Rijksmuseum, which is one of the biggest museums in the Netherlands. And they had an exhibition about slavery and the history of slavery and colonialism. On the right, you see a still from a movie about a refugee from Syria who came to Holland, and there's this beautiful documentary about him. And I was asked to do the animations, where I had to actually draw him as a cartoon character and animate him. And then the other one you see is a collection of storyboards that I did for the Amazon series Undone, which you may have seen. It just came out a couple years ago on Amazon Prime. And for this series, which was directed by a Dutch director, Hisco Hulsing, I made some storyboards. And I guess you can already see that my work is very different. It's very varied. These are illustrations I made for exhibitions in the Netherlands. The first one is also the cover of a book about immigration, so Dutch immigration into Canada. The second one is for a museum, which was a former concentration camp, actually. And so every time I have a job, I try to choose a drawing style according to the story I have to tell. So obviously these stories are very, they have to be very realistic because they're historical. So I choose a drawing style that's quite so realistic. So you can kind of feel like, oh, this really happened. And at the moment that I'm doing a funny comic, I would just switch my style around and draw something cartoony. So through the years, I've really changed my drawing style a lot. This slide shows 2 pages from graphic novels that I did. The first one was The Return of the Honey Buzzard, which is the black and white page that you see. And this one came out with Self-Made Hero, the publisher that's also here at SPX. And as you can see, again, this is totally different. This book was kind of a nightmarish scenario about a bookseller who's going through nightmares and memories from his past that he's trying to forget. So obviously I used a lot of black in here to make it feel pretty dark. And the second one on the right is a page from Blossoms in Autumn, which is a graphic novel about 2 people who fall in love at 60 and they discover love and sex at old age. And it's a beautiful, beautiful book, and it was written by Zidrou, who is a Belgian writer. And I'm very proud still of both these books, and they're also on display at the end of the back of the room, so if you want to take a look, they're over there. They'll also be for sale at SPX. I have to say this because my publisher is here. That's fine. Okay, Days of Sand. So this book, like I told you before, this is a very different beast than the ones that I did before. I was used to doing fiction and fictional books, and that was kind of comfortable for me because I could always just think of a different ending or, let something happen to the main character or whatever. It was always rooted in reality, but it was never bound to like a historical, realistic story. I never did a biography, for example. But for Days of Sand, I kind of changed that around, and honestly, I don't think I want to go back to fiction anymore, because it was just such a wild ride and so interesting. The story, to briefly summarize the story, it's about a photographer who at the age of 22 is hired by the FSA, which is the Farm Security Administration, and he's hired to make photographs in the Dust Bowl in the center of the United States in the 1930s. And the Dust Bowl was a region in the Great Plains where there were these huge dust storms and sandstorms and drought, and people just fled away from that area because they couldn't live anymore. The dust was literally everywhere, and people eventually died because of the drought. They didn't have any food or water. So it was very dramatic, and there were actually photographers at that time who took photos of these farmers. That was what the Farm Security Administration was set out to do. So it is a story that is fictional, but I would say it's historical fiction. So it is set in history, but the character that you see here, the photographer, is fictional. He doesn't really exist. He's actually based on several photographers that worked for the FSA, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. So why would I make a book about the Dust Bowl? Because honestly, I live very far away from the United States. I live in the Netherlands. And although I love coming here in the United States, I have to say that where I grew up and everything that I see around me is well, completely different from the history of the Dust Bowl. But maybe it's good to show you what triggered me into making this book, into choosing this subject. First of all, in Europe, so I'm not just talking about the Netherlands, but also about Belgium and France and all Western European countries. In the 1930s, there was a lot going on, as you all know. I mean, there was the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, the rise of fascism. And so, obviously, when we are in school and we have history classes, we hear nothing about the Dust Bowl. We just hear about Europe in the 1930s, and that totally makes sense, right? I guess I did hear about the Great Depression when I was in school. That was definitely a chapter in our book, but only because it was related to the Great Depression in Europe in the 30s. So the Dust Bowl didn't really I didn't really hear about it in school, and a lot of people that I spoke to and I talked about the Dust Bowl said the same thing. They never heard about it. They never saw any pictures of it. And so I'm not unique in this. And this was also one of the reasons I definitely wanted to make this book, kind of to introduce this thing to Europe. So how did I get involved with the Dust Bowl? It started with a photograph, of course. This was one of the photographs that I stumbled upon when I was just browsing the internet, like we all do, just a regular day on the internet. And sometimes I end up at these historical sites. I just scroll around and look at beautiful pictures from the past. I guess I'm kind of a history buff. I really love that stuff. And this photo just struck me immediately, because what you see is a huge cloud of dust. It's like a wall of dust, and it's like swallowing up the little town in front of it. And it's like a disaster movie. It looks like this is CGI, you know. It doesn't look real, but it was real. This actually happened in 1934 in South Dakota, I believe. And you can imagine that for me as a visual artist, a visual thinker, I had to save this photo to my hard drive. I have this little folder on my computer with like inspiration. If I ever have a blackout, I know what to do. You know, I have projects lined up for me, and this was definitely in that folder. So this was, I think it was 2016-ish that I stumbled upon this photo and a couple more, and this is when I talked to Warren about it, and also later I talked to Emma from Self-Made Hero about, you know, just, is this worthwhile, you know, to make a graphic novel about? I wasn't sure. And then there was a second moment that I was triggered, and this might seem a bit weird. These are two paintings of David Hockney, the British painter. Maybe you're familiar with his work. He's a painter who does mostly landscapes. His most famous painting is actually a Bigger Splash, which is a swimming pool with a splash. It's really good, and I'm actually a big fan of David Hockney. And I was doing a summer school in Paris in 2017, where, of course, the big, beautiful museum Centre Pompidou is located. And they had a new exhibition on David Hockney's work. So I went there, like, super excited to see this new exhibition and new work. And this is what I saw. And so it turns out David Hockney discovered the iPad. And, and he started drawing on his iPad. So the whole exhibition were just drawings of things around his house, like candles and flowers, done on his iPad. And they were actually pretty bad. And this is just an example. And I have to say, some of them were better, but as you can see, I wasn't like totally blown away. It was pretty disappointing. Sorry, David, if you're watching. Anyway, I was still in this museum, and I thought, okay, I need something else because I'm not satisfied yet. I mean, I paid my money to get in this museum, so let's just walk around. And at the same time, and this is just sheer coincidence, there was an exhibition of Walker Evans, the great photographer who worked for the FSA. And I did not know that name. I didn't know anything about this guy, but my boyfriend is a photographer. So I thought, you know, I'm just going to go in and then say that I went to this exhibition of, what's his name again? Walker Evans, and then you'll think that I'm cool or something. So I went into this exhibition not knowing what I was going to find, and it turns out that Walker Evans was a photographer during the 1930s, during the time of those dust storms that I saved on my hard drive. And the work in this exhibition was so beautiful. Like the photographs, you see one up here. What he did was he visited families of farmers in Alabama, for example. He just took photographs of families living there. He went inside their houses, inside their bedrooms, took photographs, the children playing, the people sitting outside on the porch. And there was something so real about it. It was as if, you know, I was there and I was just walking in that room as if these were people I knew. Like they just felt so personal. And this whole exhibition was so beautiful. I stayed there for a couple hours, and something inside me said, like, this is a sign. I have to use this somehow, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. So even after I left Paris, I was just thinking and thinking and thinking about this Dust Bowl, about this photographer, about Walker Evans. And then these images showed up on the news, images of dust storms and sandstorms in the Middle East, but also in the United States, the drought, of course, the climate change. And again, you know, I was just thinking about these photographs that I found online, and I just thought this is all too important not to make. This is a story that I have to tell. And finally, the last thing that really triggered me, that was at the same year that I was in Paris, in I think October of that year, I did something for the first time, graphic journalism. Graphic journalism is a genre within comics that is basically the same as what a photographer does when he's a journalist, like photojournalism, but then you go with a sketch pad and a pen and a pencil. And I went to the refugee camps in Greece, which were forbidden for press, they were forbidden for cameras, forbidden for journalists. But I had some contacts there, and I just basically asked them, can I enter with my sketch pad and pen? And they said, yeah, I think so. I mean, why not? So I called up a newspaper in the Netherlands and said, you know, I can go to the refugee camps in Greece and draw what I see. And there's like no pictures allowed, no photographs allowed, so this could be something. And they said immediately, okay, if you do that, we will publish this. So I went there with two other cartoonists, there were three of us. And I just documented what I saw. I made a drawn reportage of what I saw. I wasn't prepared at all because this was the first time I did something like this, but it made a lasting impact on me. So the photos that you see here, the left one is in Greece, and this is called the Life Jacket Graveyard. And this is the place, it's kind of a dump where they put all the life jackets of the people that arrive in boats and arrive at the coast of Greece. And they just dump all the life vests that they have on this mountain, and now they're kind of calling it the Life Jacket Graveyard, and it's very impressive and very sad because it's literally hundreds of thousands of life vests. I mean, you can see me walking there, you can see how big that pile is. And then on the right, you see a photo that I took 2 weeks ago in a refugee camp in the Netherlands. So, you know, this whole refugee crisis is still going on, even, you know, nobody's really talking about it anymore. In Europe, the refugee crisis is still going on. And obviously, this really interests me and still touches me to this day. Of course, in the Dust Bowl, when I was reading more about, you know, the background of the Dust Bowl and the consequences of the Dust Bowl, I found out that actually one of the biggest migrations in North America happened after the Dust Bowl, when people as refugees fled the Dust Bowl and went toward California to find jobs. You all know Grapes of Wrath, I guess, the famous book of John Steinbeck, which is about a family fleeing from the Dust Bowl. So this whole refugee crisis happened, you know, just after the Dust Bowl, and I could only see like parallel stuff in the Dust Bowl and in my own work. These are some drawings that I made in the refugee camps in Greece. Another thing that happened while I was here and I was doing these drawings, by the way, was that I was really doubting my role as a journalist while I was doing it, because obviously these are people who fled from war. These are people from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, who fled the war and terrorism. And, you know, they've been through so much, even the kids, they've been through so much, they're basically all traumatized. And here I was just making nice little portraits of them and going back home with a plane. And, you know, in my hometown, I just had a shower. I had warm water, I had food and water and everything. And it just felt so unfair to, you know, to go to that place, draw those portraits and go back and never see them again. And this was something I recognized in the Walker Evans exhibition, where the subjects of his photos also kind of complained that they never actually saw the photos that were made of them. So again, another trigger for this book. So for the people in this room who are not really familiar with the Dust Bowl, I just made like a summary of what it actually was. I think most people here know, but just to summarize, the Dust Bowl is the name for the region and also the period that it happened between 1930 and 1940. It's called the Dust Bowl because it kind of has the shape of an oval. It really is a dust bowl, and it was a region that had these immense storms. They called them black blizzards because they would blow so hard, like they would even, dogs and cats were just flying through the air. The winds were so hard. And then the black part is that sometimes these storms were so dense that they completely blocked out the sun. You couldn't see anything anymore. It was just like nighttime during the day. And obviously a lot of people left their farms, left their houses, because it was just impossible to live there anymore. You can see in this photo, by the way, you can see a farmer standing in what was once a beautiful green place, and now it's just filled with dust and sand. So here you can see that oval shape that I was talking about. It kind of looks like an avocado now that I look at it, but it's you can see that the most dense part of those dust storms were located in the panhandle of Oklahoma and a bit of Texas. And this is why I chose to locate my story also in the Oklahoma panhandle. And this part of the country, by the way, was called No Man's Land for a completely different reason, but it sounded kind of spooky, so that, that triggered me as well. This is a photo you're all very familiar with, I think. I think it's on display downstairs, or I saw it in the gallery. We were just walking by you pointed at the Thomas Jefferson Library. The ostrich, that's right, and I saw her there. Probably the most famous photo of the FSA. And to summarize very quickly what the FSA was, before we continue, this was an agency set up by the government to document the rural poverty during the Great Depression. Because of course we all know the Great Depression from Wall Street and from the big cities and the bread lines under the Brooklyn Bridge, but there was another part of America that was suffering, and that was, you know, the farmers in the rural places. So these photographers were set out to document those poor farmers, to inform other Americans, but also to be able to give relief and give help if that was needed. And it started as a resettlement administration. It went into the Farm Security Administration. And Dorothea Lange, the photographer of this beautiful photo, was one of the main photographers, but also Gordon Parks, for example, Russell Lee, Walker Evans, of course, and Arthur Rothstein. The funny thing is that I think this program wasn't set up to become this huge photography milestone, but it just became that because the photographers were so talented, and they made these beautiful portraits like this one that just that have this, I don't know, it just touches everyone that looks at it. And so now, even though the Farm Security Administration only existed for 5 years, I guess, it has this super long-lasting impact. And all the images that we basically know from the Great Depression come from this vast collection of photographs, which are here in the Library of Congress, so might be good to know. These are just a couple photos, but it's impossible to choose because it's how many thousands, like hundreds of thousands of photos, and all of them are worthwhile. So I made a quick selection to show you what kind of photos they were. They were families living in rural areas, people on the move, people on the road going toward California, children playing, that kind of stuff. Really like the real life in the Dust Bowl and real life in those farms. Just beautiful. And there was also some controversy about the FSA. There's a photo in the back of the room with a steer skull, which you will see here as well. This photo was taken, or these photos were taken by Arthur Rothstein, a photographer. And the controversy was that he actually picked up this skull and placed it in different landscapes. And you can see it in the first, like the top image. You can see that the skull is looking at the little plant, the little cactus, and in the one below, he's looking away from it. So he obviously placed it differently. And finally, he even moved it to a different landscape. Like the cracked soil that you see is a totally different landscape. So people were suddenly realizing, like, oh, maybe the FSA is staging photos. Maybe the FSA is manipulating photos to get a certain vote. because it was a federal project, of course, or maybe they had like different intentions. Should we still believe the photos that we see, or are they all like actors and stages, etc.? Of course, this is all very political, but to me it was very interesting to think about, oh, okay, so what is manipulation? And would this photographer, Arthur, really, you know, what was his idea of it? What was his response? He didn't really respond to it, actually. So I was left with these questions, which I obviously put into the book in my own character, John. I pitched the story idea to Dargo, which is a French publisher. I pitched it in 2018 with these two images. These are the very, very first images that I drew. And what you do in a pitch is you summarize a story and then you show some quick sketches and some pages to show them that this is what I want it to be. This is what I think the book will look like. And then they can say yes or they can say no. But luckily for me, they said yes. They absolutely loved this pitch. And even though these pages didn't end up in the final book, they were strong enough to convince them that this would be worthwhile. And so in 2018, I finally started writing and drawing. First thing that I do, of course, before I start with a subject like this is do research. I read a lot of books, I saw a lot of movies, I watched a lot of documentaries. You will see some familiar titles here. The Grapes of Wrath, of course. Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. There's a Taschen book on photographs from the New Deal. What else? Worst Hard Time from Timothy Egan, which is the Dust Bowl book that you should read. If you're ever going to read one book about the Dust Bowl, that's the one. And Susan Sontag wrote an essay on Regarding the Pain of Others, which is about photojournalism and the friction and the ethics of photojournalism. And all of this was very useful for me to start. You know, I had my basic information. I knew what I was going to do. This is part of the process in comics that we call thumbnailing. The reason it's called thumbnailing is that those images are as big as my thumbnail. You can see it in the little insert there. The idea of thumbnails is basically you just translate for the very first time your ideas and your fantasies to paper. Some people do it by writing. They write a scenario, but I'm not that kind of cartoonist. I just have to see it. So I do very quick drawings, very tiny, so that there's not a lot of detail. And this kind of clears my head. So I've put it all on paper, and then the next phase is to change things, to edit things, and make it more of a flowing story. But of course, at this time, I was still in my studio in the Netherlands, very far away from the Dust Bowl. And all those books and films, they gave me this starting point, and they were very helpful. Even the photos that I had from the online archive of the Library of Congress were very helpful. But I never had the feeling that I was really there. I just was drawing all these cliches. You know, I was imagining that if an American author would make a book about the Netherlands, maybe he would only draw these windmills and stuff and tulips. But, you know, the Netherlands is so much more than that. You know, there's no tulips at all. And so I thought, you know, it's not enough. I need to go there. I need to see Oklahoma. I need to see this area. Even though the Dust Bowl is long gone, I just need to go there and see for myself what it looks like. You can see here that I used those photos from the Library of Congress online archive to inspire the book. Yeah, so I chose to travel, and I actually got a fund from the Dutch Foundation for Literature to compensate for the cost that I made. So the plane and the car that I rented, all of that was paid for, luckily, and that was just fantastic because it allowed me to do much more than I had originally, you know, that I was able to do with my own money, basically. So what you see here is a map of my trip. I went with my boyfriend, Bob, together. He is a photographer, so I kind of needed him to take good pictures. And I started in Oklahoma City, that's where I flew out to, and I ended in Bakersfield. And for some of you who have read The Grapes of Wrath, this may sound familiar, because this is the exact route that the Jode family in the Grapes of Wrath has driven. So they started out in Oklahoma and they drove all the way to Bakersfield. The only thing I changed in my route was that I went to the Oklahoma Panhandle, which is a bit above Oklahoma City, but then afterward I returned to the route. And this is also part of the Route 66, of course. So I was very grateful with that fund because I was able to do this trip. Otherwise, it would have been a lot shorter. And so this is one of those photographs that my boyfriend Bob took, and you can see why I needed him. It's such a beautiful picture, and you can see also immediately why I needed to go to Oklahoma. Because for me, if I look at this, I can just imagine coming across one of those jalopies with those Dust Bowl refugees, just standing by the side of the road, changing a tire, you know. It was just exactly the same landscape as that I saw in all those photos. But this time, it was in color, it wasn't black and white, and it was alive. It had a smell, it had, you know, there was temperature, it had a sound, and it was just so inspiring that I even scrapped out a lot of instances in the book because I thought, no, this isn't at all what would have happened, you know. After coming to Oklahoma, I really knew what the real Dust Bowl would have felt like. So during that trip, I was visiting a lot of museums, I was talking to a lot of experts, I was talking to librarians and archivists, and everyone was really helpful in this research and digging up the Dust Bowl. And they were all very surprised that this Dutch girl from Europe was making a graphic novel about the Dust Bowl. But they were also so enthusiastic because normally those librarians, they work with academics and students, and now it was a cartoonist, you know. So everyone was just really, really helpful. But I think the thing that was most helpful was just the landscape. As you can see here, I used this in the book. These beautiful old telephone poles, which were still the same ones as in the 1930s. And if you look at them from a distance, you don't even see the wires anymore. There's just these big wooden crosses. And in the book, there's a scene where a character dies, and I won't spoil who it is, but after that scene, I inserted this little image of the main character driving away and passing all these huge crosses. And this was an idea that I got in Oklahoma while I was driving there. So you can see how a trip like that is really inspires the book itself. And this is the tumbleweed. I had only seen tumbleweed in movies. I didn't know it was a thing, you know. So I had to include it in the book. This is you all know this, but you know, Dutch people don't know this. And this is an image that I took to show also to the foundation, like how thorough the research was, because I was just digging in the ground, picking up the soil, feeling the soil, and this might seem a bit, you know, like an overreaction, but actually in Holland we have very different soil. Our soil is more like grayish, brown, very different structure. And so after I was like literally touching the ground in Oklahoma, I knew what it was like and I could draw it. And you can see in the book, the color is the same as the soil in my hand. And this was so useful because I had read about those dust storms. I read that they were orange and red of color. But now that I actually saw this soil in my hand, I understood why they were red and orange. Sorry. Trying to go to the next slide, but it's not working. I'm just going to try and turn it on and off. So this is another one. Those animals, another thing that I didn't know existed in Oklahoma, but the pronghorns. And these are everywhere. When you drive through Oklahoma, they're just very curious little creatures. And if you stop by the road, they just come towards you and, you know, look what's going on. And I'd never seen those creatures. I thought they were, you know, only living in Africa or something, but they actually live in Oklahoma. And this was also one of those things that I thought, I have to include this in the book. Because, you know, if an Oklahoman reads the book, they will say, ha, she's been there. and like I said, so all the researchers and the academics and historians that I asked were so nice and so helpful. And here you see Jeff Riley in the Oklahoma History Center showing me his collection of cameras. I just simply asked him, what kind of camera would this photographer use in the Great Depression? What was the type of camera that he would use? And he showed me so many. In the end, we chose a speed graphics camera. And you know, this was also why this trip for me was so special, because without all those people and all the knowledge of those people, it would never have been such a thorough book. In Cimarron County, which is also in the panhandle of Oklahoma, there's this very nice and huge museum where they have actually an old restored Dust Bowl house. And they restored everything, so the living room, the bedrooms, the bathrooms, everything is just the way that it would have been in like the 1930s. So even the dust on the table, the dust on the floor, and the dust on the beds is still there. And I just loved visiting this museum. I also took a lot of photos, and all of it came back in the book. When I was making these drawings of interiors, I was always looking at the photos from this museum. Okay, come on. I'm struggling with the technique here. I hope it's not stuck. Sorry guys. Okay, seems to be working now. Well, this is another picture from that museum. You can see the dust on the table. And the car, this is in the John Steinbeck Center in California, where they have a huge museum about John Steinbeck, but also a beautiful archive with letters from Steinbeck and everything. I was just digging through these archives like crazy, trying to photograph everything I saw. And this is actually in the Sunset Migrant Camp, also in California, where the Jode family in the book The Grapes of Wrath ends up. This was a camp that really existed and where Dust Bowl refugees lived while they were doing seasonal work in California. And to be in that place, you know, that was very special. And I didn't use it in the book in the end, but it was just so useful to finish the trip there and to go there and see where those people ended up. I guess sometimes you do a lot of research and you only use like 10% of it. But even then, it's worth it, you know. One of the cars in the Oakland Museum of California, one of those cars where the refugees from the Dust Bowl drove in toward California. So this was kind of special. This was also in the Oakland Museum of California in the Dorothea Lange archive. And Dorothea Lange was a photographer of the migrant mother, that famous photo. And all of those contact sheets that she made, her private collection, were donated to this museum, and you can just go in and take a look in all those photographs. It was just amazing. These are contact sheets, so that means that they're not necessarily all printed. Some of them are never printed, so if you go there and you go through those photos, you will see a lot of images that were never exhibited, for example. So that's really special. And now, of course, the Library of Congress, where we are right now. You might have seen this outside. I went to SPX in 2019, and I was already working on this book. I already did that whole trip to Oklahoma and California, and then I thought, okay, I need to do more research, and when I'm at SPX, I'm just going to use my time there to visit the Library of Congress and dig into that archive. These are the real photographs from the FSA, and for so many reasons, it was so useful for me to be there. I spent, I think, 5 hours in the print and photographs division to just, you know, go through all those drawers and look at all the photographs. One of the most interesting things that I saw, and you might remember the photo I showed earlier with the migrant mother. She has this kind of white skin tone, but actually the migrant mother, Florence Owens Thompson is her name, was of Cherokee descent, so her parents were both Cherokee, and she lived in the Indian Territory, so former Oklahoma. She was born in a teepee. So the Library of Congress has this print that you see on the right that was developed by Dorothea Lange herself. And Dorothea Lange, of course, saw her. She was with her, so she remembered the skin tone, and she made a much darker print of that photo, whereas the FSA, the lab of the FSA, made a picture that was much lighter, with a lighter skin tone. For me, this is so interesting. Maybe it's all very boring to you, but and I wouldn't say it's like whitewashing. I don't think that was the case. But you know, the people at the lab of the FSA never actually saw this woman, so maybe they just didn't know. These are some pictures that I saw in the Library of Congress. Just so beautiful and so real. You can imagine just spending hours and hours there. I really recommend doing that. One of the questions I still had for the staff here was, there's a scene where John, the photographer, goes running into the office of the FSA because he has a job appointment. But I didn't know where he was running to. I didn't know where the FSA was located. So I asked the staff, where was the FSA? What building? What street? You know, I want to make this scene accurate. And after a couple hours, they came back with the answer, and it was in the Department of Agriculture, which is still here today, so you can even just visit this building. And this was so useful because I could finally stage this scene, and I knew where this character was running toward. Another thing that's, some people think that I made up in the book, but it's really not made up, is the shooting script. And these are also part of the Library of Congress collection. The shooting script is the script that the FSA gave to the photographers, a list of subjects that they could follow. For example, make a photo of an interior, make a photo of farm animals, make a photo of children in a garden. They would give them this list of subjects, and then the photographers had something to work with. They weren't bound to that shooting script. They didn't have to follow it, but some photographers were very, they really followed it very thoroughly. So this is also part of the book, as you can see. And then finally, when I was here in 2019, Barbara Nathanson was still working here at the library. She's retired now, but I hope she's watching at home. Because one of the questions I had was that I had the feeling, after doing all that research, that when we think of Dust Bowl families, they're all white. And of course, if you think about the Grapes of Wrath, it's a white family. And if you look at the migrant mother, like I told you, it's a white woman. Apparently it wasn't, but you know, the way they developed their photo, white skin. And I read so many books, and it wasn't like that. There was a really big part of the farmers in the Dust Bowl who were African American. They were tenant farmers. They were landowners even. I mean, there was this stereotype that we have of the cotton pickers that were black, but really there were farmers and landowners there too. And I just couldn't figure out why we never saw the black people in those photographs. And I asked Barbara here at the library, like, what do you think is behind that? Why do we have that image of the white farmer? And apparently I asked this question to the right person, because her husband, Nicholas Nathanson, wrote a book about this very subject in 1994 or 92. And so she just walked away and came back with this book and said, read this. And what Nicholas did was I don't know if you can read it, but what he did was compare the representation of African Americans in FSA photos and then compared it to the numbers of the population at the time. And it turns out, this was for me quite shocking, because I didn't expect it, I guess, but it turns out that in 10% of the FSA photos there are African Americans. And at the time, the population of the United States was for 9.8% black. So it's actually very, very good. You know, it's almost the same number. So as far as representation goes, they did very well. And I did not expect this at all. And I still thought, like, but then what happened? You know, if this was so well done, what happened? Apparently, something else happened. It was not Roy Stryker's fault. This guy who was in charge of the FSA. It was not the photographer's fault. The main reason that there's not so many photographs of black people, you know, in our common knowledge about the Dust Bowl and the farmers is because those photographs were printed and published and selected for magazines and newspapers. And in that process, that selection, that's where things went wrong. So you will see newspapers that published photos from the FSA and not a single black person would be in the selection. So the discrimination actually happened afterwards, so after the photos were made. And of course, we have that, the Jode family, The Grapes of Wrath, that's the most well-known book and film that we know. I guess it's a combination of those factors. But I was actually very happy to know that it wasn't the FSA that was discriminating at all. And even in some states, they were like overrepresented. So that's just great. And I really wanted to include a black farmer in the book, just, to bring that story out, that not all Okies are white, So that's where this family came in. And in the background of the book, in the images, you will see these little things, like there's a picture of a background that you see here in an insert where it says, "Help wanted, white only." These are the little things that I put in to show you that segregation and discrimination were still happening. It's never really mentioned in the book, but I don't think you have to feel it. Okay, so after all that research, I came home and I had to start drawing. So the next few slides are just images from the process. Sketches, like this one, these are all done digitally in Photoshop. After this process, I do inks, which is just black and white drawings. And maybe some of you will say, well, it's already finished, but for me it definitely wasn't finished because I needed color, especially because all those photos are black and white already, and I have the power to add something to add color, so I had to add color. And in this very next slide, you see how that works. So on the left, you see the black and white image, the drawn image, and then on the right is the colored image. And this was colored in Photoshop, it's all digital. And you can see that the color really adds something. It's I don't know, the atmosphere, the feeling of it is much more clear. And I included a lot of silent pages. So there's not a lot of text in the book, even though it's quite a big one. You can read it pretty quickly because a lot of the pages are without text. They're just images. And like this one, this is over 2 pages, so it's a spread to really show you the landscape of the Dust Bowl. Here you see another page that you saw earlier in black and white. And in all of these images, you will recognize all the things I talked about in this lecture. You will see the color of the sand, you will see the type of camera that he's holding, you will see the telephone poles, you will see all the things that are stuck in the fences, the tumbleweeds and everything. All that research is in there, and I don't have to explicitly say how much I read about it, how much I know about the Dust Bowl. There's this danger in journalism, it's called notebook dumping, maybe you've heard of it, that if you do a lot of research, you kind of want to put everything in the book to show everyone how smart you are and how much you know. But the trick is to not do that and to just tell the story and let the research flow in the background, for example, like I just showed you. I mean, it doesn't have to be a school book, it doesn't have to be a history book, it just has to be an engaging story. And again, the color of the soil and everything is in there. All those little things that I couldn't have done without that research. The telephone poles. And actually, this was quite tricky to draw in the storm because I read in one of the diaries from the Dust Bowl that the clouds had a rolling movement. They were rolling over the land, and I just didn't know how to capture that in a still image. But finally, after hours and hours of trying, I came upon this and I was happy because it kind of feels like it's rolling over, but it took me a while. This is John, the photographer, having a staring contest with his camera. And so obviously he's doubting his own intentions. He's having trouble with his work. I'm not going to spoil too much because you just have to read the book. But in this scene, you can definitely see his trouble with his camera. He doesn't really feel connected to it anymore. And one of my favorite things about the book, before we move on to the Easter eggs, one of my favorite things of the book is the use of the real photographs from the Library of Congress. So what we did, so me and the publisher, is with every chapter, and there's about 8 chapters in the book, every chapter is introduced by a photograph from that time. And what I did was integrate those photographs inside the book with the drawings. And that sounds very vague, so I'm just going to show you one example. Here you see a photo that's also on display at the back of the room. And this is a photograph from the Great Depression. You see a bread line with people standing in line for bread and soup. And these were businessmen, you know, these were people who overnight just lost all their fortune. People from all walks of life standing in line for a bit of bread. And as you can see, this is near the Brooklyn Bridge, I think, and they're going all the way towards the end of the street, and then they turn around, they turn the corner. Now, as you can see, this is a spread, so these are 2 pages in the book, and you have to flip the page. And when you flip the page, this is what you see. You see that the line that went around the corner is ending up in a drawing. And this is exactly what integrates the photos with the drawing, so that each photo is part of the book, is part of the drawing, and very fluently you go from photograph to drawing to photograph to drawing. It's not just a random image. And I think this worked particularly well in the book, and I got a lot of good responses to it too. So the Easter eggs are here, so we're almost at the end. So just to show you a couple things that no one else knows about this book. And if you buy it or if you read it, you will see this. And I hope that it will just give you a little spark of joy. First of all, this is John Fahey, who was a guitarist, an American primitive guitarist. And he was the soundtrack of this book. I listened to his music almost every day while I was drawing. And it's like finger-picking guitar style based on the Mississippi Delta blues. All instrumental, so no singing. And so I decided, as an ode to the soundtrack, to base the main character John on John Fahey. So you can see in his face and his hair, all of it is almost literally based on him. Then you may be familiar with this photo from Gordon Parks, the American Gothic. And this was a photo made inside the office of the FSA. He was just hired by Roy Stryker to become a photographer for the FSA, and Roy Stryker said, you know what, just walk around Washington, walk around the office and make some pictures and just make photos of what you see. One of the first things he did was make a photo of the cleaning lady, Ella Watson, here in the office of the FSA. And so I had to include her in the scene where John is visiting the office. So if you look closely in that page, on the left, you see a woman in a green dress with the American flag behind her. That's Ella Watson. And then, of course, there's a lot of names in the book. Betty, who is a character in the book, has a very big family. She has many children, and all the children have names that are references to people who are in some way connected to the Dust Bowl, like Woody Guthrie. So there's a kid called Woody. There's a girl called Eleanor, who is named after Eleanor Roosevelt. There's Sonora, who's named after Sonora Babb, a great writer who wrote also books about her experiences in the Dust Bowl. So all those names have a meaning. And then to me, it seemed like a good idea to also reference some great American artists, just for fun. I mean, it doesn't really mean anything, but just for fun, as an ode to American culture and American art. This is one. This is the famous painting from Andrew Wyeth, Christina's World. And you see Betty is almost in the same position. Another one, painting from Edward Hopper. And I included this gas station in the book. You can see the 3 little red things coming back in the page. Of course, Campbell soup from Andy Warhol. John is eating soup from a Campbell can. I also did some digging. They were already around at the time, so it's fine. So then in May of 2021, so last year. The book came out in France because my publisher is French, and in the Netherlands, and it was a big success. I'm very happy to say that it was a bestseller, and right now we sold over 60,000 copies worldwide, with translations in Germany and Spain and English and Brazil, Poland, I don't know, everywhere. And it won 11 awards already, even in Japan, which is kind of crazy. So the Dust Bowl even, reached Japan, which is, to me, it's just amazing. And I really remembered what Roy Stryker, the head of the FSA, said to his photographers. He said, I want to show America to Americans. And I think this book showed America to non-Americans. So that's good. So the conclusion, and I hope this is all clear by now, but if you want to do research for a book, I guess the main conclusion is you have to go there. You can't just base your research on photos or films or stories in books. You have to go there and touch the sand and smell the air. And don't do any notebook dumping, but just use that research because in the end, the reader will notice it. The reader will feel that you did all that research, even though it's just in the background, like these objects in the house. It's a small thing. Nobody really explains why those objects are there, but the reader can feel, oh, okay, this is real. And one of the biggest compliments I had from readers was that they said they felt like they were actually there and they had to shake out the sand of their hair after reading the book. So that was a beautiful compliment. If you're still around here for the weekend, I really recommend you visit SPX, Small Press Expo in the North Bethesda Marriott Hotel. I will be there all weekend signing Days of Sand. There's also a copy up there if you want to look through. And I'll also be at a panel on Saturday called All Writing is Autobiographical, where I'll talk a little bit about my other work. But for now, this was my presentation. I hope you really enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, maybe this is a good time to do questions? Yeah? Okay. Let's do the questions then. Well, thank you all for listening. Thanks.
Okay, so we're going to alternate between our live audience here and the
Yeah.
questions that have been asked online. So we'll start off with a question from the audience.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk.
Sure.
I wrote a graphic novel about my great-grandfather, and it took 4 years of research.
Wow.
And at a certain point, I had to stop myself.
Right.
When was the point where you stopped yourself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I also had to stop myself because you can just keep on reading and keep on. And I did animation for a while, animated films, and they always said that people could get stuck easily in the conceptual phase because it's very tempting to just keep on sketching and thinking and writing storylines and never actually starting because it's kind of scary to start. So like you, I had to stop myself and say, okay, now I'm just going to start. And I think I was in 2018, so that was already 1 year after I started doing research. So yeah, after 1 year. But I'm impressed that you did research for 4 years. That's crazy. I'm very curious about the book now.
Okay, so I just want to tell Aimée that Barbara Natanson is online, and
Hey,
she
Barbara.
did send you a comment to say hello and thank you for looking so closely and thinking so deeply and portraying the experience of the Dust Bowl migrants and FSA photographers so evocatively. It was wonderful to hear about the research and creation process.
Oh, thanks, Barbara. Yeah.
This is sort of a negative question, and I apologize for that, but have you gotten anybody using this as a climate denier, saying that global warming has been occurring in America for 90 years now, it's nothing new?
Oh, good one. Well, so far so good, but I don't know. I guess the Dust Bowl is just an instance, it's just an example of how climate change has been happening for decades. I mean, it's getting to like a boiling point right now, but it's clear to me that it's always been happening and it always will happen. But yeah, so far the responses have been good, and no climate change deniers so far. But if you know any, just give them the book and maybe they'll change their minds. I guess not, but maybe is that it for the question? Oh, another one.
Beforehand, I was reading the first few pages of the book now, and I was just so engrossed in it, I had to set it down because we were starting. And I was wondering, in that early scene when the photographer is interviewing for the job, and I guess it's Roy Stryker,
Yeah.
says, "Oh, your work thus far has been very focused on Black subjects."
Right.
Where was your inspiration for that? Was it based on the history of an individual photographer? And then separately, I was wondering, when you were in Greece, did you have an opportunity to, I guess, operate differently than the photographers that operated in the Dust Bowl? For instance, you get to leave a copy of the portrait of Muhammad with him.
Well, thanks for the great questions. So yeah, so maybe I should explain that exactly. In the beginning of the book, John, the photographer, comes into the FSA office and he shows his portfolio. And in this portfolio are many pictures of Black people in the streets of New York. And Roy Stryker then says, well, we're looking for a photographer in the South. And so I don't know if you're a good photographer for that, because there's not a lot of Black people left in the South. This was based on the Great Migration. I think you're familiar with that history, that after the freedmen, there was this huge migration wave of the Black people coming from the Deep South, going to the big cities like New York, but also to the west, northwest, northeast of the United States. This went on for many, many years. And they were fleeing from the lynchings. They were fleeing from discrimination, segregation in the southern states. And so a lot of Black people ended up in New York, for example, but also in Washington and the big cities. And so John, this photographer, is taking photos of these communities. And I guess it was mostly based on that history. I really wanted to put that in. And also the Black family that's in the book is part of that migration wave. They're coming from the Deep South and they're traveling toward California. So it wasn't based on a particular photographer, but it was more based on the history of how that happened. And I mean, there was a huge migration wave. There was like 6 million people, I think, who fled from the Deep South. It's incredible. I think I should make another graphic novel about that topic, because it's, you know, again, in Europe, nobody really knows about this. Well, it's so interesting, and it really changed everything in the United States. And then the second question about Greece, it's funny because I was actually in touch with some of the refugees that I drew portraits of, and I sent them the final work afterwards. But this is also kind of not all journalists do that, because they're afraid that people might want to change things. Like they could say, oh, I don't like how you drew me. Can you make another drawing of me? Like I know Joe Sacco, for example, never shows his work to the people he interviewed, and it's like, well, you could, but then they will definitely tell you to change this and this and this and this. And after a while, it's also a question of trust, I guess. You have to trust the journalist. But to me, it was very important to share it, so I did, and they were happy. So that was good. Yeah. Well, thanks.
We have a question online. If you could write another historical fiction book, what would the topic be?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I'm actually, right now, I'm in the process of creating a picture book about migration through history. So from the very early migration out of Africa until, you know, the war in Ukraine, basically, all the big migrations. it's huge, but I'm so interested in people on the move. So it would be something with migration, but I don't know which one. I mean, there's so many. Yeah. Okay, I think that's it. Oh,
Okay, last call. Any questions in the room or, oh,
last one.
I'm a librarian, so this is kind of a librarian question.
Okay, good.
After you did all the research, did you include a bibliography in your book?
Yes, well, I didn't really put a bibliography in the book. I have a list of all the photographs that I used and all the reference numbers and everything, so you can look those up. I didn't include a list of books because this is really a comic book thing, but people don't do that in comic books. So if you read any other academic book, you will find a list of all the books that were referenced, but I didn't. Sorry. You can always send me an email and just ask. Okay.
well, thank you, Aimée. I think
Thanks so much.
Deb is going to close us out here, and we just had a few more comments online thanking you again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks everyone.